Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 24th of July. Today we have really important updates from the Prohres direction. We're going to zoom in and just straight up begin with a deep dive into the dynamics over here because we do have a lot of updates. Beginning with Novoosokerske, we talked extensively about the battles that have unfolded here for about a week and a half. We know that the Russian forces, their main vector to enter into the village was through this northeastern path from Novoosokerske, along with this in tandem attack coming directly north along the road. At the same time, you had a Russian infiltration which really broke the Ukrainian lines over here from the southeastern direction along this particular paved road, which allowed the Russian forces in recent days to seize parts of the southern half of the village. And this was actually displayed based on video footage from the 68th Jaeger Brigade, a unit that I knew was over here, but we didn't have proof of their engagements in the battle. It's up until recently. So we know that the Ukrainians moved in a lot of resources from nearby in order to try to hold the village, not just from the 47th Brigade, which did move in several battalions into this general theater, but the one that is most notable is the Shkval Battalion, an inmate-only battalion. I don't know their size because in their commencement photo, there were only 78 inmates photoed, but it could be more. And a lot of them were actually trained to become Bradley operators. But I'd say most of them are just trying to conduct some of this bottom of the barrel frontline combat operations, which they desperately need. They desperately need infantry to go to the ground, go to the areas that are the most dangerous, and just fight over there. And sometimes hold on to very disadvantageous positions in order to buy time. And so that's really the perfect profile for a battalion like Shkval and why they were moved in. So you did have the Ukrainians try to conduct localized counterattacks using Bradleys from the northwestern portion, crossing over the river and attacking over there. For a couple of days, it was able to repel the Russian assaults before the Russians were able to eventually overcome the Ukrainian holdouts in some of these residential areas and in nearby fields. This was done a lot because the Russian forces had worked hard to secure control of heights that are overlooking the supply lines into the village and also, of course, overlooking the village itself. At the same time, you had this concurrent Russian attack occurring just south of the village, which is still going on, but it's not the main Russian focus at the moment, although that could change now that the village has fallen because this is this large swath of land. I think it's like 4 kilometers wide if you measure it. Yeah, 4.2 kilometers wide. And it's just this massive piece of land, not really fortified, and it's located on a hill that gives the Ukrainians an opportunity to overlook Novoosokerske, but at the current moment, they don't have momentum on their side. They don't have a large amount of troops on this eastern bank of the river. The Russian forces definitely want to seize it, and that would give them the opportunity to overlook the final 2 villages east of the Vavcha River, still under Ukrainian control, those being Skuchnia and Mezhove, these 2 sort of vertical hamlets that only consist of a single road and are going to be very difficult to hold on to, and losing them would imply the Russian forces then had ability to actually cross over the river, especially around Mezhove, where you do have this physical crossing, of course, because the river is so narrow, and then also this bridge. I don't know if it's a bridge even, but it's just this path just to go westwards and actually cross towards the Ukrainian defense lines and villages on the west bank. So we knew about the capture of Prohres now for a couple of hours. On the 24th of July, the DPR's 114th Motor Rifle Brigade, that's the name of the unit. I want to find their icon, but they actually raised the victory banner in the southwestern corner of the village, so they were heavily involved in the attack. So you did have, of course, a combination of the 1st Army Corps, not just this unit, but also several others around here, territorial defense units that were recently created as a part of new divisions. There are several new divisions that are just completely made up of territorial motor rifle regiments. And the 27th is a good example of one that has been implemented, introduced to the front line in recent months. And so one of their motor rifle regiments has been very active around here. They also, of course, have the activity of the 15th Brigade Russian unit that's been involved in a lot of the Ocheratina breakthroughs and artillery fire especially. And then you have some assault units like this one over here that have been involved in the cutting-edge Russian attacks. And that's a go forward because Novoosokerske, we look at it, and it's understandable that over a period of time, the Ukrainian reinforcements were not able to hold on to it. It is relatively disconnected now due to supply lines being fired upon from the main Ukrainian corpus westwards. And then again, the Russians already had control of higher elevated regions east and north. And so really it was always going to be an uphill battle for the Ukrainians. But what's more concerning, you could say, is the fact that there were a lot of issues surrounding the Ukrainian defense around Prohres that are now being raised and mentioned by Ukrainian media. And so what I'm going to be reporting on now after the frontline updates is just purely from the Ukrainian side. And also we have to look at the way they're framing it and try to understand the deeper psychology behind it. But first, we have this update from Deep State indicating that the Russian forces were able to advance around 400, 500 meters westwards as the Russians have now fully repelled the Bradley-oriented counterattacks that have kept the Russians at bay around Yevanivka, around the western portions of the hamlet for a week and a half now. And so that was due to, of course, the 47th Brigade, both their gunners on armored fighting vehicles, but also because of their drone crews that have spotted individual Russian soldiers walking along these paths towards the front line and just one by one took them out. And there's a lot of footage of that from this region. The Striker Drone Company has been heavily involved in doing that. But we just look a couple of 100 meters northwards, and there was this just big gap that was exposed in the Prohres region. And it has less to do with the fortifications here because, even if you look at Novoosokerske Persha, there's only one fortified asset north of it that really wasn't of consequence during the Russian advances. But the reason why Prohres did fall so quickly is a combination of the Russians having momentum in this region, the elevation, and also the quality of the units that were defending here. And so according to Deep State, first of all, we already know that by July 19th, the village was under an initial Russian DRG operation. By the 20th, it had fallen into Russian hands. And by now, the 24th, we know that the Russian forces have advanced along the rail line several hundred meters, 500 in the southwestern direction, and at this point are already conducting the initial DRG preparations to infiltrate and take over Vovche. The way in which the Russians went about this, according to Deep State, and according to also Yuri Butusov, who is, a very big Ukrainian military journalist, they're saying that the Russian forces are specifically attacking in regions where they know for sure that the Ukrainian unit composition is less organized, less cohesive, and generally of a lower caliber. That could be in terms of manpower, but it maybe is not because they may have new recruits that were moved in, but simply don't have a good brigade headquarters to coordinate their missions and to allocate resources effectively. And so then they just become so disorganized that it's just obvious to try to assault in those regions and then, of course, take advantage of the flanks where there are still Ukrainians holding on. And so what's being alleged by Ukrainian sources is that Prohres was an example of this, and there was a defensive unit that was holding here, and that faltered very quickly, was not able to put up a fight against the Russian forces, and already withdrew in the southwestern direction, perhaps to Vesele, Ivanivka, Vovche, whatever it may be, and the situation was not able to be saved. There was no silver lining by the 47th Mechanized Brigade. There has been a lot of instances, efforts by that brigade to hold the line when the Ukrainian defenders are unable to, and sometimes it's successful. In this case, the 47th was not able to do so, and I think it's because they're so split now, that brigade. All of the battalions are engaged in some sort of frontline combat, whether it be around Yevanivka or Persha, and so they didn't have the full amount of resources in their quiver to combat the Russian advance, of course. And so, yeah, it was deemed futile. Now, I have qualms with the fact that the unit that was in charge, allegedly, of Prohres was not explicitly mentioned. They mentioned all the other units surrounding the incident, but not the one that was actually involved in manning this region, which would give us a lot of insight into the quality of such a unit. Now, we could, of course, speculate based on just informed videos that are geolocated to nearby regions which unit it could have been. It could have been, for instance, the 2nd Galician National Guard Brigade, National Guard unit that's recently been active around here over the past couple of weeks. You have the 110th Mechanized Brigade, which is generally operating a couple of kilometers northwards around Lozhevatske and Novoalexandrivka. So I don't know if it's them actually, but we don't have the information, so I can't really make a good analysis based on that. 116th Brigade, they were very infamous for defending around Berdichi and the coke plant and so, and those were 4 or 5 months ago, and since then they've not had that big of a presence on this part of the front line, mainly been in rotation during that time period. Maybe they'll be reintroduced, I'm not sure. And you also have 68th Jaeger Brigade, but they appear to be further south, not necessarily around Prohres, so I'm really unsure regarding that. What we do know about unit allocation and about pockets that are being formed is surrounding the region just to the north. We're looking at this sort of pocket over here that is in between Novoosokerske and the rail line. And according to the reporting of deep states, they were contacted by elements of the 1st and 3rd battalions of the 31st Mechanized Brigade, claiming that they had nearly been cut off within a local height. If I'm not mistaken, it's 269.3. That's what they refer to it. And if you weren't clear yet, then it's over here. What's being alleged is that elements of these two battalions were holding the front line, essentially along some of these fortified structures over here and tree lines. It does appear to be a good region to defend because it is on a hill overlooking not necessarily the region directly east of it where the Russians are attacking from, but perhaps overlooking a region like Novoosokerske that the Russians had just taken over. But the issue really turned into, really began to magnify when the Russian forces began to capitalize on their momentum along the rail line, which is their main vector of attack, acknowledged by everyone. Batusov saying that there were companies of Russian soldiers always pushing through these windbreaks, which just makes sense because, again, at a certain point, Ukrainians become overwhelmed and they can't spot all of the Russian soldiers concealed in those regions. And so they advance along the southern flank and then begin to push into Ukraine's rear over here. You can see with these two vertical arrows. And they also took advantage of their base in Novoosokerske and the nearby hills to push into Novoosokerske, where the 110th Brigade definitely was defending, but didn't have the wherewithal to hold on to it. The Russian forces took it over. It's now sort of like a frontline region where they could push through and stop for a second. And now they've actually pushed even further southwest. And this is all happening within the context of the Ukrainian soldiers from those two battalions still holding out within the local height that is sandwiched in between those two Russian attack vectors. Now, what's being alleged is that the battalion commanders, so that would be the 1st and 3rd battalion commanders, they were actually more sympathetic to the regular soldiers. And again, that also has to do with proximity because they're directly affected by a lot of these sort of movements. And so they were more willing to allow movement and retreats for Ukrainian forces. But the actual brigade structure, the brigade headquarters, the commander of the units was simply not allowing them to retreat from these positions. So they were forced to hold strong over here while the Russians sensed that they were not going to withdraw. And so they just pushed on along the flanks. And according to the reporting from Deep State, it's now created a situation where they're in this very, very narrow pocket. The way out, you could see it very clearly. It is feasible, definitely, because we've seen Ukrainians get out of pockets in the past, but now without heavy casualties. And I don't know how many troops are being held up over here. It's probably not a massive amount, maybe in the dozens, if I had to guess, within some of these trenches and dugouts. But then again, you're looking at elements of two battalions, and that's like probably 2 out of 3 mechanized battalions within a mechanized brigade that are holed up over here and could suffer serious casualties. That is a significant amount. And I don't know the actual strength of this brigade. I know this brigade, 31st Brigade, fought a lot during the counteroffensive over a year ago now. It was one of these NATO-created units, a lot of emphasis on mechanized, rapid breakthroughs, but all of that was thrown in the trash since the counteroffensive, and it's been purely operating from a defensive capacity ever since. First round of Avdiivka, then we now know that it's defending at least with 1 battalion, probably the 2nd battalion, around Novoosokerske, and then these other 2 units are here trying to hold out, at least to a certain extent, within Novoosokerske. And I do think that their battalions are probably not at full strength, but nonetheless, most of their elements are probably not encircled in here. Most of them are probably just operating generally in the regions around Prohres. That would be some of the rear towns in the region. But again, it is still a difficult situation, and we shouldn't look past the fact that these Russian flanks really are a threat to other Ukrainian villages in the region. So let's look at that for a second. The Russian forces, we knew they had captured Novoosokerske, but now we know they've advanced basically 2 kilometers southwest, nearly reached this vertical road that connects, I guess, the southern part of the Ukrainian line all the way to Timofivka. So they're going to have access to a vertical road that then leads northwards directly to the ring road that we always talk about on the Konstantinivka-Pokrovsk highway. And so Timofivka is in really serious danger right now. because once this pocket is closer, the Ukrainians are able to withdraw from here. The Russians will have full control over all of the heights associated with the rail embankment. The Ukrainians will have lost all of them in this region, and all that will be left for the Ukrainians elevation-wise will be from river valleys in key villages like Timofivka that will be directly overlooked. On a micro level, it actually does have a lot of importance because you could directly see into those villages, fire towards them from close quarters, and get a good idea of where the Ukrainians are positioned. And so Timofivka is going to be in a lot of danger. So will the Sishnie, and going further north, also Votvizhenka, where the Russians have been kept at bay for a while because their advance is along a very narrow vector. Now they're going to have more momentum to actually push through and take over that village. And the fall of that village and nearby villages along the Prohres River would basically spell the end for this final line of Ukrainian defense before the Russians reach these fields northwards and actually reach the Ring Road, which, if we're measuring it from Votvizhenka, is about 5.5 kilometers away. And yeah, that's definitely a big issue logistics-wise for the broader southern Donetsk or western Donetsk agglomeration for the Ukrainians. But I really don't think it's just about going northwards and cutting off that road. Because if you're looking at how far away that road is from the key cities, it is a rather big distance that you're looking at, something like 14 kilometers away. I do think there's going to be a particular emphasis on an advance along the rail embankment deeper into this southwestern direction, which we're already seeing manifest with the capture of additional fields west of Prohres. I do think that Vasily is in the way, so definitely there's going to be some sort of combat over there. And you could see how the Russians are positioning themselves in a way in which they'd be able to get control of local heights that are overlooking the tributaries that basically lead into Hordivka. Hordivka is a really important local command and control center, and then when you look at the roads that it connects to, it does lead into Mirnohrad, and Mirnohrad is the eastern suburb. It's not even a suburb, it's a city in its own right, just east of Pokrovsk. And so there's a big issue surrounding this rail embankment, not just for Hordivka, but also for these sort of cities further south, like Novoosokerske. You have to look into that. And you also have to look more generally into artillery, not necessarily ground assaults anytime soon, but into the movement of mid-range artillery closer and closer to the line of contact that previously was established, but now the Russians are pushing westwards into regions like Orlivka, for instance, but even further west, Umanske. Novoosokerske Persha is going to become a forward artillery hub, I believe, at a certain point. And they're going to be firing from 20, 30 kilometers away towards cities like Selidove. You could look at it from the front line, and Selidove is only about 17.5 kilometers away. You could look at Mirnohrad. At the moment, if you're looking at the furthest Russian advance, then it's only about 15, 16 kilometers away from Mirnohrad. And we already know that the Russians have moved in a significant amount of artillery assets into Cheretine, and that's already having an effect on frontline villages and perhaps will also have an effect on Hordivka. And as the Russians feel more comfortable moving in artillery further west and west, that's when it will begin to have an effect on these logistics hubs. So really do keep an eye out for that. We have here a video from July 23rd from the Birds of Magyar Regiment. It's now been labeled the 414th Regiment, a part of Ukraine's Marine Corps. It's an FPV compilation of about 14 minutes, so I had to skim through it. But it shows just various strikes on abandoned Russian tanks, on artillery systems, like we said. And so now the Birds of Magyar unit, which is up there as one of Ukraine's best drone units, and it really has such high praise that it's been made an entire regiment, and it's separate from any sort of Ukraine brigade. They were previously centered around Hliboke, defending over there, and the situation just deteriorated so much over here, and we're going to get into why in the drone aspect in a second, but the situation here was so dire that they needed to redirect it away from a key part of the front line like Hliboke and the Kharkiv front into an even more critical situation, which would be over here. And so you see that the units are not just being moved in from the rear or from reserves. The Ukrainians are rotating forces back and forth between key sectors, and that's just the genesis of the problem. But now we're going to begin seeing Birds of Magyar more active in targeting these Cheretine sort of assets, and so there may be an increase in Russian unit losses in whatever sort of platform you're looking at. All of them are probably going to suffer more damage. Also, individual soldiers will probably be targeted more. And the reason why Ukraine is doing this is because there's a massive issue with coordination of drone crews over here. The brigade headquarters in a lot of these units are just simply AWOL. They're not organized well at all. They're not coordinating between one another, the brigade headquarters in some of these units. A lot of that is because not the entire brigade is operating in some of these fronts. Sometimes it's only a battalion being moved in. And so then you don't have a centralized structure that could actually be involved in the operations. And so this has a downstream effect on the drone crews where they're not assigned proper locations or targets. And then it's very confusing. It can't be coordinated with infantry or with fixing positions for artillery, for instance. And then it just becomes ineffective. And so that's one issue. The other issue is you have a lot of friendly fire when it comes to electronic warfare systems. The Ukrainians definitely have improved their sort of apparatus surrounding electronic warfare, but it does backfire sometimes and lead to a large amount of Ukrainian drones actually being rendered useless and falling down from the sky due to Ukraine's own electronic warfare. And so that's an issue that they also have to deal with. And so there are several just glaring issues regarding brigade structures, brigade quality, coordination between them, drones that the Commander-in-Chief, Chief Siersky, really has to address. We're looking at it now, a lot of complaints regarding brigade leadership in some of these regions. Batusel, for instance, says that there's a lot of commanders, could be at least commanders, that are in the reserves of the Ukrainian military that served for a very long time from 2022 to 2023 and are simply not being appointed to positions where they would be qualified for in perhaps company positions or even higher than that. And he says that, on the contrary, a lot of these brigade commanders specifically do suffer from a lack of experience. I don't know how true that is, but I do know that in so many of these brigades, like the 47th, there was just constant turnover, and that is never good for an entire organization. And so there's like turnover every 4 months with that unit, and it's one of Ukraine's best units that's defending over here. So imagine how much more of an impact it has on a more volatile unit, for instance. But this gets us to the final issue of today's video, which is regarding something said to Deep State by these soldiers from the 31st Brigade. They're saying that in a lot of these frontline engagements, they no longer have a commanding specific leader to organize their actual movements on a day-to-day basis in their efforts to defend here. A lot of the company commanders, they're claiming, are either killed or wounded. And at that point, of course, they can't really give you orders when you're defending in the sort of pockets. And so then you get this issue where you're not getting company orders anymore, and then the battalion commanders have more weight, and it's the sort of blending between the responsibilities of a local company that should be more closer to the front line, smaller, more insular, of course coordinating with other companies, but should be really on its own in the field over there. And it's sort of getting blended in with the larger sort of battalion, which should be focused on a broader part of the front line, not just on a specific field, but on several kilometers of fields and several villages. So there is sort of a graying of the lines between the roles of battalions and companies. And when I'm saying companies, I'm talking about groups of up to 200 men. And so I'm not trying to insinuate that the manpower issues in the battalion are basically akin to the size of an entire company, because it's not that severe, but you still have to keep in mind that there are a lot of inadequacies in filling up these battalions up to their full potential. And when you finally do get the reinforcements, you get the new recruits, they don't actually receive the full extent of the training because they do need to be moved to the front line quickly. And so then all your new recruits that, of course, are of fighting ability that could serve in an infantry capacity are moved over there, and there's no strategic reserve because there's no one left to be sent to strategic reserve. And so then you don't have additional training for those men. You don't have men to basically set up perimeter on a second or tertiary line of defense, and you don't have any sort of backup units that could be called in to sort of act as rotation for frontline units. And those are just inevitable consequences of those chronic issues. And yeah, that's all that for today. So thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Well, goodbye.